We're now going to turn to an expert panel here, and I'll just very quickly reintroduce the speakers, and then we'll turn to their brief remarks. Just working my way from my immediate right is Steve Rademacher, former Assistant Secretary of State, in many capacities a former Assistant Secretary of State. And in addition, he's been a leader on issues related to nuclear nonproliferation, stopping the spread of nuclear dangers. He also previously served in many capacities in the executive branch, as well as serving in many capacities in the legislative branch, including on the House International Relations Committee. Next is, to my right, is Ray Takei, whose remarks were momentarily paused, hopefully much like Iran's nuclear program. Ray is at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he has been covering Iran issues for a long, long time. And last is Ruel Marc-Gerecht of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He formerly served in the intelligence community, and both those gentlemen over there have probably forgotten more about Iran than most people in this town will ever learn and know. So I'd like to thank them. And Ray, again, I apologize that we had to pause your talk, but please continue.
Sure, I'll continue. I'll just wrap up by saying there are the negotiations in Vienna, or the stalemated negotiations in Vienna, I think indisputably demonstrated that we don't have sufficient coercive leverage. If we had, we would have a settlement. There are two ways I think we have always thought about coercive leverage. One is the notion of economic sanctions, and I think Ruel will talk about this as well. I obviously, this level of economic sanctions that have been imposed on Iran have been successful in segregating Iran from the financial markets, but they have not been sufficient. They've been necessary, but not sufficient. Now, whether another sanctions bill will get through, and even when it does, it'll take 6 months for Treasury to actually implement it. So it remains to be seen. But certainly at the existing level of economic pressure has not induced Iran to negotiations. But there is another aspect to strategy of pressure that our unusual focus on economic sanctions have neglected, namely what is taking place in the region. The region today, as I was mentioning, is very much divided against itself. Those divisions are based on sectarian identities. You have Iran and the revisionist Shi'i forces versus Saudi Arabia and the Sunni sector. And this particular civil war is playing itself out in Lebanon, most certainly in Syria, increasingly in Iraq, to some extent in the Gulf, although I do believe some Saudi assertions in the Bahrain are certainly exaggerated. But nevertheless, Iran seems to be on the march in the region. It has buttressed the power of the Assad dynasty. It has managed to infiltrate Iraq. It is certainly a player in terms of turning Hezbollah into not just lethal group in Lebanon, but in the wider terrorist organization. And so whatever confidence-building measures we're negotiating, so long as Iran remains triumphant in the region, it is very difficult for it to be disabused of the notion that nuclear capability is important and relevant to the task of regional hegemony. An emerging hegemon is unlikely to give up potential weapon sources that can aid in that process. I think in many ways, the Obama administration is in a fork-in-the-road situation. It has one of two choices. It can very systematically re-engage in the region and try to reverse Iranian gains. That means it has to be a material player in Syria, an important player in Iraq, and so forth. There doesn't seem to be appetite for that, and that's sort of a cumbersome task. The other thing it can settle for is essentially a series of interim agreements, not unlike, as I mentioned, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the final agreement proves elusive, but you have a series of interim agreement that puts some conditionality. The final aspect is what usually happens whenever the great powers, including the United States, have met Iranian intransigence, and whenever a stalemate is negotiated, is upon them, they usually adjust their red lines. That was a story of the Bush administration. That was a story of the first-term Obama administration. And so far, I think the administration has to be commended in one sense that they didn't negotiate a bad deal in Vienna, which would have been a spectacularly bad deal, but whether that resolution continues to remains to be seen. But as I said, I think if we didn't have the deal by July 20th, it was unlikely we were going to get a deal, a permanent deal. Iranians by this time know what they have to do. They just don't want to do it. Well,
I think Steve was going to go next.
Steve Rademacher.
Yes, thank you, Bobby. And Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak this morning or this afternoon. I worked as an arms control negotiator in the Bush administration, and was also responsible for non-proliferation policy. And so I sort of look at this from a diplomatic perspective, and I look at the details of what's under negotiation. And I'm personally deeply alarmed by what I see unfolding in Vienna. And with your indulgence, I want to explain why I am troubled. First of all, in November of last year, they reached, the two sides, the P5+1 and the Iranians reached an agreement on a joint plan of action. And what that joint plan of action provided was that there was to be a 6-month period where both sides were to do some confidence-building things, while their diplomats continued to meet to hammer out a new agreement. And this new agreement, what it's called in the Joint Plan of Action, is the final step of a comprehensive solution. And that's the label. So what are they negotiating today and what have they agreed apparently to extend the deadline on the negotiations for? It's the negotiation to achieve the final step of a comprehensive solution. I'd like to see a comprehensive solution to and a final step with Iran, but my message to you is that label for what they're negotiating is a complete misnomer, because the Joint Plan of Action specifies two things about the final step of a comprehensive solution, and what I'm going to read you from the Joint Plan of Action, but what I'm about to read you is already agreed. Okay, so these 2 points are not under negotiation; they've already been agreed. The first thing that's already been agreed is that the final step of a comprehensive solution will have a specified long-term duration to be agreed on. In other words, even though they call it the final step, it's not a permanent step. It's going to be an interim step, a temporary step, and it will expire. And so the parties are arguing now about how long the duration will be, but it's agreed it will have a limited duration and it will expire. And in fact, on that point, the New York Times reported 2 days ago that the Iranian position is that the duration of the final step should be between 3 and 7 years. That's what they're arguing for. The position of the Obama administration is the duration should be in double digits, meaning at least 10 years. So that's the range. They're arguing between roughly 10 years on the one side and 3 to 7 years on the other. But let's say the Obama administration gets 10 years, which would, I guess, in terms of what they're negotiating there, would be a good outcome. That would mean this final step goes away after 10 years. Well, then what happens? Well, the Joint Plan of Action answers that question, too. It says, following successful implementation of the final step, the Iranian nuclear program will be treated in the same manner as that of any non-nuclear weapon state to the NPT. So in other words, when the final step expires, the real final step kicks in, and the real final step is that they're treated like a normal nation. So, important to ask, how are they to be treated in the same manner as that of any other non-nuclear weapon state to the NPT? How are those states treated? Well, let me give you some examples. Uranium enrichment, that's what we're all worked up about, right? Iran is enriching uranium, and they've got 20,000 centrifuges, of which about half are running. So they're running about 10,000 centrifuges. And we're really angry about that. We're really worried because we think they might be producing the material for a nuclear weapon. Well, the Netherlands, Britain, and Germany have an industrial consortium called Urenco. And it enriches uranium using centrifuges on a commercial basis to supply nuclear reactors all over the world. I don't know how many centrifuges Urenco runs, but it's in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of centrifuges that they run. So, Iran, once it's entitled to be treated in the same manner as any other non-nuclear weapon state, will be able to say, we want to be like the Netherlands. We want to run hundreds of thousands of centrifuges to produce enriched uranium that we're going to sell to people. And if they demand that right, they're entitled. That's under the terms of the Joint Plan of Action, they will be certainly entitled to do that in 10 years. Japan, we're worried about the Iraq heavy water facility because they can use that to produce plutonium. It's an efficient producer of plutonium. Japan has about 50 nuclear reactors, and their policy is that they're going to separate plutonium from the spent fuel of their nuclear reactors. And they spent billions of dollars constructing a facility to separate plutonium from spent nuclear fuel. And in theory, one day they're going to blend this plutonium with highly enriched uranium and create a reactor fuel called MOX that they'll put into nuclear reactors as reactor fuel. But they're not actually doing that right now. What they're doing now is stockpiling plutonium. And highly enriched uranium is one thing you can use to build a nuclear weapon. The other thing you can use to build a nuclear weapon is plutonium. And Japan has a lot of plutonium, and they're accumulating more because they're separating it. And so if, under this agreement, if Iran wants to do that in 10 years, they'll be able to, Japan's a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT, they can say, we want to be like Japan. We want to separate plutonium. We're planning to make MOX fuel for reactors one day, so we're going to separate plutonium. We have that right, and they will be right. They've been assured that they can do that. What we've been most worried about with Iran is that they might enrich their uranium to higher levels, because the low enriched uranium that they've been making, the 3.5% level, really can only be used in a nuclear reactor. They started making 20% enriched uranium, which was alarming to us, but you can't build a nuclear weapon out of 20% enriched uranium. It has to be enriched to about 90%. Well, there's another non-nuclear weapon state part of the NPT that is enriching uranium to 90%. It's Brazil. Now, why are they enriching uranium to 90%? Well, they've said that they want to have a nuclear navy. And guess what? America has a nuclear navy. Guess what it runs on? 90%, more or less, roughly 90% enriched uranium. We use highly enriched uranium to fuel the nuclear reactors on our aircraft carriers and that sort of thing. And Brazil says they're going to do the same thing. And we've accepted that. Nobody complains that Brazil is enriching uranium to 90%. The door is open for Iran in 10 years to say, well, we've actually decided we need a nuclear navy. And you were okay with Brazil enriching to 90%. So, that's how you treat non-nuclear weapon states, and we're entitled to the same treatment, so we're going to do that. So I am deeply alarmed about the track that we're on. I mean, we're buying restraint for some period of time, but the cost of that restraint is when it ends, there will be no restraint whatsoever. Iran will be legally entitled to do virtually whatever it wants, subject to safeguards. I mean, the IAEA will inspect, but if we had great confidence in IAEA safeguards, we wouldn't be sitting here today, because, I mean, Iran is subject to IAEA safeguards today. Now, they're supposed to approve a sort of a more intrusive inspection regime, which will be good, but again, this more intrusive regime called the additional protocol is not so intrusive that we'll have high confidence that if they're producing plutonium or 90% enriched uranium or vast quantities of low enriched uranium, that we have nothing to worry about. And that's the track we're on. I hate to see the diplomacy collapse, but I fear that the foundation of the current diplomacy, which is this bargain that they're to behave for some period of time, and then all the restrictions are off. All the more intrusive inspections, all the things that they're arguing about, how many centrifuges, to what level can they enrich, that's only for the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years. After that, all those restrictions go away, and that has already been agreed.
Steve, thank you for your remarks. And before we turn to Q&A with everybody, we have Ruel Marc-Gerecht, Senior Fellow with the Foundation of Independent Democracies. And then afterwards, I'd like to open up to you guys, to you in the audience. You've waited and listened, and we'd like to hear what you have to say. So, Ruel, please.
I thought I was going to get to miss my depressing comments. I have to say, it's a very good thing that I'm old enough that I grew up on Monty Python's Flying Circus, because that way I can appreciate the surreal. And I just have to say, I mean, everybody, I think almost everybody in Washington knows they're pretending. And the Iranians are pretending that they're really not on a nuclear weapons quest, and the Americans are pretending that Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif are somehow also not on a nuclear weapons quest, and we can somehow negotiate away their nuclear weapons quest, which has been at the center of Iranian defense policy for almost 30 years, and that, let us all recall, that Hassan Rouhani really does have a right to claim, along with his former mentor, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, that he is one of the founding fathers of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. So what we are essentially are saying is that one of the founders of the Iranian nuclear weapons program is going to give away the nuclear weapon, and that's just fine. And it is, yeah, I would suggest to you it just isn't plausible. What Rouhani, I'm pretty sure the bet was the deal he made with the supreme leader, who, by the way, seems reasonably content with the nuclear progress that was made from, 2005 to 2013, and he should be, because the most important work done on the nuclear weapons program in Iran was done at that time, is that, listen, I'll be able to do the same thing as Ahmadinejad did, but I'll be able to do it with less trouble, less diplomatic trouble, less international trouble, that we may have to slow down the nuclear weapons program. We won't give it up. But we may have to slow it down so that we can get economic sanctions reduced. And I think what the Rouhani is probably playing for, and I think he has the Supreme Leader's approval on that, and he has the Revolutionary Guard's, I think, approval on that, is to try to get the European oil ban, the EU oil ban, lifted. Because the truth is once they get that ban lifted, the game's all over. Their conception of economic prosperity is somewhat less than ours. You get the EU oil ban lifted, and I think the Europeans, by the way, will tell you fairly forthrightly, the French, who have been much better in this whole process than we have been, will tell you once it starts to come down, they can't graduate it. It's just going to come down. So I would expect, if a deal were reached, that you would see the EU oil embargo come down fairly quickly in this process, say a year, 2 years max, and basically the whole game's over. You're not going to have to worry about a sunset clause, because I think once the EU oil embargo goes down, it's not coming back up. That may not be the case with central bank sanctions. You can fine-tune those a lot more, but I think that's what the Iranians are playing for. And to be honest, I think the administration, they're not really playing for a long-term solution to this. They're just playing for a short-term solution, because that's what administrations do. So I think the real truth is that the administration could get the status quo frozen until the end of their term in office, it'd be great. And then it will be someone else's problem. And I think that's the likely scenario. I think it's possible that we could have a diplomatic deal if the Americans and the French, and they will be the only two who would object, if the Americans and the French are essentially willing to accept whatever the terms were that were offered by Zarif before recently. And they might, because the Iranians are essentially telling us, and the former nuclear negotiator, Rouhani's factotum between 2003 and 2005, and the former ambassador to Germany, has actually, Hossein Mousavian, has actually been fairly explicit in saying that, listen, your choice is either greater, quote, transparency over the known nuclear sites or war. And that's what they're saying. You accept what we want, or let's have a fight about it. And certainly I think that's the way the administration sees this, because they are very reluctant to apply real economic pressure. They usually make excuses that the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans won't go along with it. They don't even try. Let's see. I think the correct approach is let's see how much pressure we can actually bring and see if we can hold the essential allies together. And I would argue those are really only the Europeans. The Russians and the Chinese are less important in this process. But they don't go there because I think the Iranians have convinced them they'll walk. I actually think they might walk. But I mean, that tells you, gives you some idea of how important the nuclear weapons program is to the regime, how they've invested in it, how their national identity is tied up in it, how their religious identity is tied up in it, and that if one is going to believe in coercion as a tool, a diplomatic tool to change this, you're going to have to apply an enormous amount of leverage, far greater leverage than the administration has so far applied. So I think what's going to happen is they're going to suggest that, in fact, the interim deal is the final deal, or we just have more and more interim deals, as Ray suggested, and I suspect the administration might go for it. They might. Congress might even go for it. Because the real truth, again, is that President Obama is going to roar out of the gate, and he's going to say, "My way or war." And as we all know, that in the past proved somewhat effective with Democratic members in Congress. I suspect it will prove effective again. It may prove effective with Republican members of Congress. So I think if there is going to be any type of diplomatic process in this that continues, and it certainly will continue, can continue easily until January of 2015 when the JPA officially expires, it's going to be this sort of status quo maintained, and then the president is going to use his executive authority to release sufficient sanctions relief that will keep the Iranians going. There's a chance that on the Iranian side this might tank, that the Iranians actually won't find this satisfactory. They may. It all depends how much real relief they think they're getting from the administration and from the Europeans. And if by chance they do get the European embargo relieved from this interim, sort of continuing interim deals, then I think they'll be quite content. They will want this to go on because basically everything they have in their program will be sustained. They'll have the right to continue centrifuge research. They'll have the right to maintain their ICBM program. They're not going to get rid of their heavy water reactor at Iraq. They'll just inject perhaps less fuel into it. So nothing that they'll compromise on will be irreversible, which for them, I think, is the red line which they've held consistently, and you have to give the Supreme Leader credit. He, at least, respects his own red lines. And I'll stop there.
Ruel, thank you very much for your comments, and I think it's now time to turn it over to you guys, and we would love to hear your questions, your concerns. So raise your hand. We should have microphones around. Great. Nina, please come over. And if you could state your name, your professional affiliation, and ask a question. Yeah, please.
My name's Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst. Iran is in possession of a working Chinese design that it got from the AQCon network. I think we're all living in la-la land, thinking that the first time we get a notification is going to be a P wave arriving at some seismogram in Turkey, when in fact the initial test may be in downtown Tel Aviv. My question is, could we circumvent one of Iran's main arguments by giving them a lifetime supply of medical isotopes at no cost?
I'll just say one thing about this. There has been, the Iranians' claim is that they have to indigenously produce it because they don't trust any sort of international guarantees. There has been a lot of proposals about providing international fuel bank for them and so on, but they have rejected that based on an argument of hyper sovereignty. So I suspect that offer would have been rejected by them.
Yeah, if I could just comment, I think what you're suggesting is take away their pretext for producing the 20% enriched uranium. First of all, why are they enriching at all? Well, their answer, we need fuel for a nuclear reactor. Okay. Right, but we need fuel for a nuclear reactor. How many nuclear reactors do they have? They have one. How are they fueling it now? Well, they have I think it's a 12-year contract with Russia to supply fuel. So, in the civil nuclear power area, the pretext was stripped away years ago.
Sure.
They haven't backed down a bit in their enrichment program. I guess I'm skeptical that if we said, here's a lifetime supply or as many medical isotopes as you could possibly want, that they would lose interest in enriching to 20%, because they're not enriching to 20% to be able to produce medical isotopes. They're doing it as a form of political pressure on us. I mean, all along it's been, in the last 3, 4, or 5 years, people like us would sit around in rooms like this and say, well, what we need to do is pressure the Iranians, increase the economic pressure on them. Now, and we did, and successfully. People like Senator Kirk and others, did important work. But think about on the Tehran side. What were they doing for the last 3 to 5 years? You think they were sitting around saying, "Oh my God, there are going to be all these sanctions. We're just going to hunker down and try and survive this"? They thought, we're going to pressure them back. How are we going to pressure them back? We're going to deploy more centrifuges. We're going to enrich to higher levels. Okay, so I mean, this was their form of pressure applied to us. And it was a pretty effective form of pressure. I mean, I would argue, highly effective. If you looked at the timelines, I think their ramping up of their enrichment program was sort of proceeding faster than our ability to inflict economic pain on them through our sanctions. Just the final point, and this is the technical point, but if they need a pretext to enrich to higher levels for political reasons, which I would argue is why they're doing it, they don't have to rely on medical isotopes. They can go the Brazil route and say, well, actually, we're going to start enriching to 90% for naval propulsion purposes. And in fact, I think they always had that card. They were waiting to play that. Had we not gotten to the negotiating table, I think that was going to be the next shoe that would drop. That they would just start enriching to an even higher level. Again, not because they actually plan to deploy a nuclear navy, but because they're trying to pressure us and respond in some way to our efforts to pressure them economically.
The gentleman right behind, please, name, affiliation, and a question.
Yeah, Jeffrey Herf for the University of Maryland. I wanted to pick up on what Real Gerecht said regarding everyone pretending. Let's assume that the people in the White House administration are all very intelligent, which is, I think, a good assumption. They must know that what you just said is the case, that Iran wants the bomb, that Congressman Engel was probably wrong, that sanctions have not worked. The implication of that is that the actual policy of the United States is not to prevent Iran from getting the bomb, but to contain and deter Iran once it has the bomb. And the three of you have, you're familiar with the administration, you obviously don't speak for it, but do you think it's a plausible conclusion that the actual policy of the United States government is to let Iran get the bomb and then contain and deter it, or hope to do so after that happens?
I think they're hoping that to some sort of no, I'm not persuaded by that. I think they're still hoping that some sort of a technical arrangement can be achieved that will delay the Iranian program and will give the international community sufficient time for detection should the Iranians break out of some of their restraints. I still think that's probably where they're at, as opposed to having sort of mentally acquiesced to the prospect of an Iranian bomb.
I agree with that.
Okay. Up front, Mario? Yeah.
Just scream.
Hello.
Yep.
Mario Loyola, formerly of the Senate Republican Policy Committee, and now National Review, I guess. Question for Mr. Rademacher. You talked about how how the parties have already agreed that Iran is going to be treated as a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT, under the Joint Action Plan at the end of this whole process. And I'm very perplexed about how this is going to work. The reason why Iran is not being treated as a non-nuclear weapon state now is because of a series of questions that have remained unresolved that have prevented the Director General of the IAEA from reporting to the Board of Governors that he is confident in the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. The United States doesn't have any authority over what the Director General reports to the Board of Governors, and the IAEA is not a party to these negotiations. So how, in effect, is this going to impact the internal process of the IAEA, and how does this agreement not just completely sideline and undermine the authority and legitimacy of the IAEA?
Well, I guess as a technical matter, it wasn't that the IAEA decided on any action because of their concerns. It was the UN Security Council that decided on actions. It was the relevant political authorities well, they found that, unable to, that they were unable to conclude that the program was entirely peaceful. But it was the Security Council that decided to order them to stop enriching, and that was the legal foundation for the sanctions. Basically the JPA, Joint Plan of Action, sidesteps this issue in a way that I do think is very harmful to the IAEA. I talked about how the comprehensive solution, when it expires, everything is normalized. It is not, and I've read this document very carefully, it is not a precondition to the normalization of Iran's nuclear status or the legitimation of their nuclear program, that the IAEA be satisfied. That is not written in here. I mean, there's a mechanism in here where there's a commission set up, and the commission's to work with the IAEA and Iran to try and facilitate resolution. But there's no consequence attached should that effort fail. In other words, everything I described in my remarks about how at the end of the day, when the 10 years or whatever it is expires, Iran is a normal nation, that doesn't depend on anything except compliance. It depends on them not cheating on their commitments during that I'm going to say 10 years. I mean, that's not a great, but during that 10-year period, as long as they don't cheat, they're not caught cheating, then they're a normal nation. And if they haven't satisfied the IAEA under the JPA, as I read it, well, that's unfortunate for the IAEA and maybe unfortunate for the international community, but legally, they complied with, because they were not required. There's nowhere that they are required to actually satisfy the IAEA. It doesn't matter who's in power. It doesn't matter. Ahmadinejad could be reelected. He could be the leader of Iran in 10 years when they are to be legitimized. He could be giving speeches about how Israel has to be wiped from the face of the earth. None of that matters because there are no political preconditions to this. And it really is deeply alarming because we have other instances where countries that had nuclear weapons programs were rehabilitated, where we decided, okay, we're prepared to accept that you've abandoned nuclear weapons aspirations and are now, you're keeping a nuclear program, but we accept it as purely peaceful. And I can cite those examples. South Africa, which was the subject of Senator Kirk's chart, they had a nuclear weapons program. In fact, they had nuclear weapons. I mean, South Africa had nuclear weapons under the apartheid regime. But then Nelson Mandela was democratically elected, new government. He said, we want to give this up. We don't want to be a nuclear power. And because of the political transformation that had taken place, the world was prepared to accept that. We were prepared to accept that there had been a fundamental change of heart in South Africa. And so South Africa today has a civil nuclear program. We don't worry about it. Brazil and Argentina, pretty much the same story. I mean, under military dictatorships, both of those countries had nuclear weapons programs. And in the late 1980s, they had democratically elected governments that said, we don't want this anymore. We're joining the NPT. We're giving up our nuclear weapons ambitions. And both of those countries today have civil nuclear programs, and we don't worry about them. We accept that the democratically elected governments in those countries have different priorities. The problem with the JPA is there doesn't have to be any political change in Iran whatsoever. In fact, they could change for the worse politically. It doesn't matter. It's not a precondition to, after 10 years, them being treated like any other country when it comes to nuclear stuff. All the UN sanctions go away. Restrictions on commerce, nuclear commerce with Iran go away. So if Russia wants to sell them nuclear technology, they're entitled to do so. Both Russia and Iran. And nothing illegitimate at all about that kind of commerce. All of our sanctions, all of our nuclear sanctions have to go away. I mean, that's part of what's required here too, irrespective of whether Ahmadinejad is running the country.
I might just add one little thing on that. I mean, it's worthwhile talking to Ali Heinonen, the former number 2 at the IAEA and now at Harvard. I mean, he is, on the record of being deeply concerned about the JPA actually nullifying a lot of the IAEA's work. I mean, it's quite clear the IAEA, not with much success, has been after the regime to confess to its past efforts of weaponization. If the JPA says you don't have to confess at all, obviously you've got a problem there, not just now, but in the future. So,
Great. We have time for about maybe 2 or 3 more questions, so let's take them all at the same time, and then we'll let the speakers do their thing. So I think there's in the back, to my left, and then lady right there. Okay. Let's take all 3 at the same time, so please ask your question.
Shala Sadiqi from Voice of America Persian TV. I would like to ask panel whether the turn of the events, recent turn of the events, especially in Iraq, has had any effect or could have any effect on the parties on the negotiation, even Russia, could it, fell apart or changes their position on regarding on their interests?
Thank you. And let's take a second question over here.
Yes. I'm Tony Sennett. I'm formerly a strategic analyst for General Abizaid and Tommy Franks, and I'm currently with the International Rescue Committee. I think to preambulate my question, particularly Raj and Rul will appreciate this. I think the distinguishing characteristic that we all have to acknowledge is that the theocratic state of Iran is run by the supreme rulers in Qum, not the mouthpiece in Tehran, and that they believe that Allah wants them to establish a caliphate, and that in order to do that, they have to be a nuclear power, and that it's perfectly justifiable to lie and deceive for Allah. And so they will stall and use every tactic they can to ultimately achieve their aim. We also have to acknowledge that we have a pacifist regime in the United States.
I'm sorry, we're short on time. Can you ask a
And
question?
so in light of that, what are the odds that either the United States or a surrogate will be militarily prepared to react kinetically if in the next 2.5 years Iran achieves a nuclear weapon?
Okay, an Iraq question, a use of force question, and I think we had one more from, please, right there. Raise your hand up high, and you get the last question.
Hi, my name is Haneen. I'm with the East-West Institute. I just wanted to know whether or not policymakers are considering certain or alternative mediums for propelling negotiations with Iran and promoting civil discourse. And when I say mediums, I'm referencing currently the sanctions regime that the U.S. has on Iran. Alternative mediums could include maybe focusing on narco-trafficking and also maybe propelling Iran's economy, which is currently, I think, the 7th largest in the world. Maybe if we open up its economy and integrate it even more with the Western world, they could be a little bit more compliant with U.S. demands, and yeah.
Great, thank you for your question. All right, let's just go down the line, I guess. Answer what you like, and offer whatever closing remarks you want.
you pick one.
Start with you, Steve.
Okay. Well, I think the first and the last questions really go to the question of the possibility of reconciliation of some kind between the United States and Iran. And, there are a lot of people who would like to see a fundamentally different relationship between Iran and the United States. So, for instance, in Iraq, it turns out that essentially Iran and the United States are on the same side. We both support the Maliki government. We want to see it succeed against the self-styled Islamic State. So does that mean that could be a foundation for future cooperation? There was an op-ed in the Washington Post last weekend. Tom Pickering, a very distinguished former career State Department official, Bill Lures, and Brian Crocker basically threw out the notion that, essentially the same one that framed the question. Could we cooperate with Iran now in light of the challenges we face, where we seem to have common interests? I'm deeply skeptical. I mean, we have problems with Iran because of Iranian policies. Their national ambitions are to promote Islamic revolution, the formation of a theocratic state. They fully intend as a nationalistic matter to dominate their region. I think that's an important rationale for the nuclear weapons program. The Saudis and our other friends in the region are deeply worried about that. So I guess what troubles me about all this sort of, I'll call it wishful thinking on the part of people like Ambassador Pickering, there's no change on the Iranian side that seems to be required in this proposal. Iran gets to continue doing all the things that we found deeply threatening for the last 35 years. But because we're worried about their nuclear program, because we share a common interest in defeating the Islamic State, we'll start collaborating with them going forward. That would completely destroy our relationship with the Sunni governments in that region. I mean, the Saudis and the people who supply much of the world's oil would be profoundly unsettled by a U.S. strategy of that kind. So I see it as sort of a siren song, let's just wish the Iran problem away. But it may be a tempting siren song to some, perhaps even in the Obama administration, but I hope they don't succumb to it.
On the first question on Iraq, I haven't seen Iraq actually affect the dynamics of these negotiations. Both parties have tried to sort of insulate the nuclear negotiations from a variety of regional developments, whether they can be coincidence of interest or even like prospectively Iraq or even in Syria where the two sides are very much at odds. They have sort of tried to insulate nuclear diplomacy from a regional turmoil that is sweeping the Middle East. On the use of force, I don't anticipate the use of force by the United States or any of its allies in the next several years, so long as the diplomatic process, I think, goes on. Everybody is invested in the success of this process as opposed to its disruption, even if the process has ebbs and flows and does not yield a permanent agreement. On the final question, I think that was the predicate of sort of a détente policy of early 1970s with the Soviet Union, the notion that if the Soviet Union becomes more integrated into the global economy and the global society, it would act with some degree of restraint. In Henry Kissinger's phrase, then it would want to be contained. I think when you see with sort of ideological states, and the Soviet Union in the 1970s continued to have the pool of ideology, is they tend to separate commerce from their ideological advancements. The Soviet Union did not see a necessary inconsistency between participating in Dayton and invading Afghanistan. And so these regimes tend to be much more compartmentalized in terms of their approach as opposed to linked in together. As Steve said, I think there are some ideological barriers in terms of improvement of relations between the United States and Iran. More so on their side than probably on our side, but I'm not quite sure if that sort of a détente logic of early 70s applies in this case.
I mean, all I would add is I'd actually like to see regional issues become issues in the nuclear discussion. We ought to use them to our advantage, but that would have to mean that we become involved and that we would have other pressure points to push. But again, it seems to only work in reverse now. That the Iranians actually can continue to do whatever they want, and it either doesn't affect the nuclear negotiations or even encourages some folks in Washington to believe that the nuclear negotiations are a stepping stone to solving the regional problems, which I think is to get it absolutely backwards. On the economic question, I'm always amused by those who believe that capitalism will soothe the savage beast. I particularly like it when those arguments usually come out of the left. It's sort of an updated variation of the old Ottoman tactic of putting the troublesome son into the harem and hoping that pleasure every single day would enervate him. I think it had more success under the Ottomans. It's possible. I think when the Europeans in 1992, 1993, the French and the Germans, sort of opened up to the Islamic Republic and explicitly said that we hope our trade will moderate your behavior. I don't think it worked out terribly brilliantly. I think there might be some argument to say that tangentially, perhaps some of that led to the surprise victory of Mohammad Khatami in 1997, but it's always good to remember that Mohammad Khatami was crushed, and he was in part crushed by Ali Akbar, Hashemi Rafsanjani, and Hassan Rouhani. They became less fans of the man that they actually helped get elected. So I don't think that it has really that much to do. I don't think greater trade with Europe, even though certainly Rouhani is in favor of that, and he's quite explicit in his past writings of believing that greater trade with Europe is an essential element in fighting the United States. That I don't think that greater trade with Europe, though desired in Iran, is going to do anything to moderate the behavior of the Supreme Leader, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, or even Mr. Rouhani. So I'm not terribly optimistic about economic determinism. I just don't think it historically works. On the one thing on the Iranian side, I mean, the Shiites really aren't terribly big on the caliphate idea. That historically that didn't work out too well for them. But I just don't. Again, as I said, I don't think the odds are terribly good that for people who do see, religion in ways that we simply do not. I mean, if you talk to members of the administration and they're talking about various Iranian officials, it is quite shocking the secular way they talk about them all. It's as if none of them, they just don't do proper justice. That's what I find most disturbing, is that you ought to show respect, and you ought to show respect to religious commitment. And in the West, that often isn't done, and I think it's done because to do so would obviously make the problem appear far more intractable in our own eyes. And we don't want to do that because we want to believe there's some easy answer that doesn't involve the use of force. So I'll stop there.
Ruel, thank you. Ray, thank you. C, thank you. Just in closing, I think three short themes emerge from today. One, it's pretty clear that there's a strong consensus, bipartisan consensus, that a bad deal is worse than no deal, but also that there are high standards for a good deal. That's the first pillar. I think the second pillar that came out today was the nuclear problem is a symptom of a larger issue, which is the regime. The regime in Tehran, which is a state sponsor of terror, a violator of human rights, a pillar of instability in the Middle East and Iraq and elsewhere in Syria. And I think the third point that comes out today is that Congress, which created the non-military pressure that brought Iran back to the negotiating table, should have a say in how this all goes forward. And it's regrettable that Congress certainly has not had a collective chance to express its opinion about where things are going. It has not had a collective chance. But we hope today that we were able to bring some members together to give members of Congress a chance to have their say. This debate is not going away. So on that upbeat note, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.